Volume 2, Chapter 22 of Travels in the Interior of Africa by Mungo Park. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. War and Slavery. A state of subordination and certain inequalities of rank and condition are inevitable in every stage of civil society. But when the subordination is carried to so great a length that the persons and services of one part of the community are entirely at the disposal of another part, it may then be denominated a state of slavery, and in this condition of life a great body of the negro inhabitants of Africa have continued from the most early period of their history, with this aggravation that their children are born to no other inheritance. The slaves in Africa, I suppose, are nearly in the proportion of 3 to 1 to the freemen. They claim no reward for their services except food and clothing, and are treated with kindness or severity, according to the good or bad disposition of their masters. Custom, however, has established certain rules with regard to the treatment of slaves, which it is thought dishonorable to violate. Thus the domestic slaves, or such as are born in a man's own house, are treated with more lenity than those which are purchased with money. The authority of the master over the domestic slave, as I have elsewhere observed, extends only to a reasonable correction, for the master cannot sell his domestic without having first brought him to a public trial before the chief men of the place. But these restrictions on the power of the master extend not to the care of prisoners taken in war, nor to that of slaves purchased with money. All these unfortunate beings are considered as strangers and foreigners, who have no right to the protection of the law, and may be treated with severity, or sold to a stranger, according to the pleasure of their owners. There are, indeed, regular markets, where slaves of this description are bought and sold, and the value of a slave, in the eye of an African purchaser, increases in proportion to his distance from his native kingdom; for when slaves are only a few days' journey from the place of their nativity, they frequently effect their escape. But when one or more kingdoms intervene, escape being more difficult, they are more readily reconciled to their situation. On this account the unhappy slave is frequently transferred from one dealer to another, until he has lost all hopes of returning to his native kingdom. The slaves which are purchased by the Europeans on the coast are chiefly of this description. A few of them are collected in the petty wars, hereafter to be described, which take place near the coast; but by far the greater number are brought down in large caravans from the inland countries, of which many are unknown, even by name, to the Europeans. The slaves which are thus brought from the interior may be divided into two distinct classes: first, such as were slaves from their birth, having been born of enslaved mothers; secondly, such as were born free, but who afterwards, by whatever means, became slaves. Those of the first description are by far the most numerous, for prisoners taken in war, at least such as are taken in open and declared war, when one kingdom avows hostilities against another, are generally of this description. The comparatively small proportion of free people to the enslaved throughout Africa has already been noticed, and it must be observed that men of free condition have many advantages over the slaves, even in war time. They are in general better armed, and well mounted, and can either fight or escape with some hopes of success; but the slaves, who have only their spears and bows, and of whom greater numbers are loaded with baggage, become easy prey. Thus when Mansong, king of Bambara, made war upon Carta, as I have related in a former chapter, he took in one day 900 prisoners, of which number not more than 70 were freemen. This account I received from Damon Jumma, who had 30 slaves at Kemu, all of whom were made prisoners by Masong. Again, when a freeman is taken prisoner, his friends will sometimes ransom him by giving 2 slaves in exchange. But when a slave is taken, he has no hopes of such redemption. To these disadvantages it is to be added that the Slattees, who purchase slaves in the interior countries and carry them down to the coast for sale, constantly prefer such as having been in that condition of life from their infancy, well knowing that these have been accustomed to hunger and fatigue, and are better able to sustain the hardships of a long and painful journey than freemen; and on their reaching the coast, if no opportunity offers of selling them to advantage, they can easily be made to maintain themselves by their labor; neither are they so apt to attempt making their escape as those who have once tasted the blessings of freedom. Slaves of the second description generally become such by one or other of the following causes: 1. Captivity; 2. Famine; 3. Insolvency; 4. Crimes. A freeman may, by the established customs of Africa, become a slave by being taken in war. War is of all others the most productive source, and was probably the origin of slavery; for when one nation had taken from another a greater number of captives than could be exchanged on equal terms, it is natural to suppose that the conquerors, finding it inconvenient to maintain their prisoners, would compel them to labor, at first perhaps only for their own support, but afterwards to support their masters. Be this as it may, it is a known fact that prisoners of war in Africa are the slaves of their conquerors, and when the weak or unsuccessful warrior begs for mercy beneath the uplifted spear of his opponent, he gives up at the same time his claim to liberty, and purchases life at the expense of his freedom. In a country divided into 1,000 petty states, most independent and jealous of each other, where every freeman is accustomed to arms and fond of military achievements, where the youth, who has practised the bow and spear from his infancy, longs for nothing so much as an opportunity to display his valor, it is natural to imagine that wars frequently originate from very frivolous provocation. When one nation is more powerful than another, pretext is seldom wanting for commencing hostilities. Thus the war between Kadja and Kasson was occasioned by the detention of a fugitive slave; that between Bambara and Carta by the loss of a few cattle. Other cases of the same nature perpetually occur, in which the folly or mad ambition of their princes and the zeal of their religious enthusiasts give full employment to the scythe of desolation. The wars of Africa are of 2 kinds, which are distinguished by different appellations. That species which bears the greatest resemblance to our European contests is denominated Kili, a word signifying to call out, because such wars are openly avowed and previously declared. Wars of this description in Africa commonly terminate, however, in the course of a single campaign. A battle is fought; the vanquished seldom think of rallying again; the whole inhabitants become panic struck, and the conquerors have only to bind the slaves and carry off their plunder and their victims. Such of the prisoners as, through age or infirmity, are unable to endure fatigue, or are found unfit for sale, are considered as useless, and I have no doubt are frequently put to death. The same fate commonly awaits a chief or any other person who has taken a very distinguished part in the war. And here it may be observed that, notwithstanding this exterminating system, it is surprising to behold how soon an African town is rebuilt and repeopled. The circumstance arises probably from this, that their pitched battles are few. The weakest know their own situation, and seek safety in flight. When their country has been desolated, and their ruined towns and villages deserted by the enemy, such as the inhabitants have escaped the sword and the chain generally return, though with cautious steps, to the place of their nativity, for it seems to be the universal wish of mankind to spend the evening of their days where they passed their infancy. The poor negro feels this desire in its full force. To him no water is sweet but what is drawn from his own well, and no tree has so cool and pleasant a shade as the taba tree. Footnote: This is a large, spreading tree, a species of Sterculia, under which the bentang is commonly placed. Of his native village, when war compels him to abandon the delightful spot in which he first drew his breath, and seek for safety in some other kingdom, his time is spent in talking about the country of his ancestors, and no sooner is peace restored than he turns his back upon the land of strangers, rebuilds with haste his fallen walls, and exults to see the smoke ascend from his native village. The other species of African warfare is distinguished by the appellation of tegria, plundering or stealing. It arises from a sort of hereditary feud which the inhabitants of one nation or district bear towards the other. No immediate cause of hostility is assigned, or notice of attack given, but the inhabitants of each watch every opportunity to plunder and distress the objects of their animosity by predatory excursions. These are very common, particularly about the beginning of the dry season, when the labor of the harvest is over and provisions are plentiful. Schemes of vengeance are then meditated. The chief man surveys the number and activity of his vassals as they brandish their spears at festivals, and, elated with their own importance, turns his whole thoughts towards revenging some depredation or insult which either he or his ancestors may have received from a neighboring state. Wars of this description are generally conducted with great secrecy. A few resolute individuals, headed by some person of enterprise and courage, march quietly through the woods, surprise in the night some unprotected village, and carry off the inhabitants and their effects before their neighbors can come to their assistance. One morning during my stay at Camilla we were all much alarmed by a party of this kind. The king of Fuladeu's son, with 500 horsemen, passed secretly through the woods a little to the southward of Camilla, and on the morning following plundered 3 towns belonging to Madigai, a powerful chief in Jonakadu. The success of this expedition encouraged the governor of Bangassi, a town in Fuladeu, to make a second inroad upon another part of the same country. Having assembled about 200 of his people, he passed the river Kokoru in the night, and carried off a great number of prisoners. Several of the inhabitants who had escaped these attacks were afterwards seized by the Mandingos as they wandered about in the woods or concealed themselves in the glens and strong places of the mountains. These plundering excursions always produce speedy retaliation, and when large parties cannot be collected for this purpose, a few friends will combine together and advance into the enemy's country, with a view to plunder or carry off the inhabitants. A single individual has been known to take his bow and quiver and proceed in like manner. Such an attempt is doubtless in him an act of rashness, but when it is considered that in one of these predatory wars he has probably been deprived of his child or his nearest relation, his situation will rather call for pity than censure. The poor sufferer, urged on by the feelings of domestic or paternal attachment and the ardor of revenge, conceals himself among the bushes until some young or unarmed person passes by. He then, tiger like, springs upon his prey, drags his victim into the thicket, and in the night carries him off as a slave. When a negro has, by means like these, once fallen into the hands of his enemies, he is either retained as the slave of his conqueror, or bartered into a distant kingdom; for an African, when he has once subdued his enemy, will seldom give him an opportunity of lifting up his hand against him at a future period. A conqueror commonly disposes of his captives according to the rank which they held in their native kingdom. Such of the domestic slaves as appear to be of a mild disposition, and particularly the young women, are retained as his own slaves. Others that display marks of discontent are disposed of in a distant country, and such of the freemen or slaves as have taken an active part in the war are either sold to the Slatees or put to death. War therefore is certainly the most general and most productive source of slavery, and the desolations of war often, but not always, produce the second cause of slavery, famine, and in which case a freeman becomes a slave to avoid a greater calamity. Perhaps by a philosophic and reflecting mind, death itself would scarcely be considered as a greater calamity than slavery; but the poor negro, when fainting with hunger, thinks like Esau of old, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" There are many instances of freemen voluntarily surrendering up their liberty to save their lives. During a great scarcity, which lasted for 3 years, in the countries of Gambia, great numbers of people became slaves in this manner. Dr. Laidley assured me that at that time many freemen came and begged, with great earnestness, to be put upon his slave chain, to save them from perishing of hunger. Large families are often exposed to absolute want, and as the parents have almost unlimited authority over their children, it frequently happens, in all parts of Africa, that some of the latter are sold to purchase provisions for the rest of the family. When I was at Jara, Dame Juma pointed out to me 3 young slaves whom he had purchased in this manner. I have already related another instance which I saw at Wanda, and I was informed that in Fuladu, at that time, it was a very common practice. The third cause of slavery is insolvency. Of all the offenses, if insolvency may be so called, to which the laws of Africa have affixed the punishment of slavery, this is the most common. A negro trader commonly contracts debts on some mercantile speculation, either from his neighbors, to purchase such articles as will sell to advantage in a distant market, or from the European traders on the coast, payment to be made in a given time. In both cases the situation of the adventurer is exactly the same. If he succeeds, he may secure an independency. If he is unsuccessful, his person and services are at the disposal of another. For in Africa, not only the effects of the insolvent, but even the insolvent himself, is sold to satisfy the lawful demands of his creditors. Footnote: When a Negro takes up goods on credit from any of the Europeans on the coast, and does not make payment at the time appointed, the European is authorized by the laws of the country to seize upon the debtor himself, if he can find him, or, if he can not be found, on any person of his family, or, in the last resort, on any native of the same kingdom. The person thus seized on is detained, while his friends are sent in quest of the debtor. When he is found, a meeting is called of the chief people of the place, and the debtor is compelled to ransom his friend by fulfilling his engagements. If he is unable to do this, his person is immediately secured and sent down to the coast, and the other released. If the debtor cannot be found, the person seized on is obliged to pay double the amount of the debt, or is himself sold into slavery. I was given to understand, however, that this part of the law is seldom enforced. A fourth cause above enumerated is the commission of crimes on which the laws of the country affix slavery as a punishment. In Africa the only offenses of this class are murder, adultery, and witchcraft, and I am happy to say that they did not appear to me to be common. In cases of murder, I was informed that the nearest relation of the deceased had it in his power, after conviction, either to kill the offender with his own hand or sell him into slavery. When adultery occurs, it is generally left to the option of the person injured either to sell the culprit or accept such a ransom for him as he may think equivalent to the injury he has sustained. By witchcraft is meant pretended magic, by which the lives or healths of persons are affected. In other words, it is the administering of poison. No trial for this offense, however, came under my observation while I was in Africa, and I therefore suppose that the crime and its punishment occur but very seldom. When a freeman has become a slave by any one of the causes before mentioned, he generally continues so for his life, and his children, if they are born of an enslaved mother, are brought up in the same state of servitude. There are, however, a few instances of slaves obtaining their freedom, and sometimes even with the consent of their masters, as by performing some singular piece of service, or by going to battle and bringing home 2 slaves as a ransom. But the common way of regaining freedom is by escape, and when slaves have once set their minds on running away, they often succeed. Some of them will wait for years before an opportunity presents itself, and during that period show no signs of discontent. In general, it may be remarked that slaves who come from a hilly country, and have been much accustomed to hunting and travel, are more apt to attempt to make their escape than such as are born in a flat country and have been employed in cultivating the land. Such are the general outlines of that system of slavery which prevails in Africa, and it is evident, from its nature and extent, that it is a system of no modern date. It probably has its origin in the remote ages of antiquity, before the Mohammedans explored a path across the desert. How far it is maintained and supported by the slave traffic which for 200 years the nations of Europe have carried on with the natives of the coast, it is neither within my province nor in my power to explain. If my sentiments should be required concerning the effect which a discontinuance of that commerce would produce on the manners of the natives, I should have no hesitation in observing that, in the present unenlightened state of their minds, my opinion is, the effect would neither be so extensive nor beneficial as many wise and worthy persons fondly expect. End of Volume 2, Chapter 22. Volume 2, Chapter 23 of Travels in the Interior of Africa by Mungo Park. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gold and Ivory. Those valuable commodities, gold and ivory, the next objects of our inquiry, have probably been found in Africa from the first ages of the world. They are reckoned among its most important productions in the earliest records of its history. It has been observed that gold is seldom or never discovered except in mountainous and barren countries, Nature, it is said, thus making amends in one way for her penuriousness in the other. This, however, is not wholly true. Gold is found in considerable quantities throughout every part of Manding, a country which is indeed hilly, but cannot properly be called mountainous, much less barren. It is also found in great plenty in Jalan Kadu, particularly about Buri, another hilly but by no means an unfertile country. It is remarkable that in the place last mentioned, Bori, which is situated about 4 days' journey to the southwest of Camilla, the salt market is often supplied at the same time with rock salt from the Great Desert and sea salt from the Rio Grande, the price of each, at this distance from its source, being nearly the same, and the dealers in each, whether Moors from the north or negroes from the west, are invited thither by the same motives that are bartering their salt for gold. The gold of Manding, so far as I could learn, is never found in any matrix or vein, but always in small grains nearly in a pure state, from the size of a pin's head to that of a pea, scattered through a large body of sand or clay, and in this state it is called by the Mandingoes Sano Munco, gold powder. It is, however, extremely probable, by what I could learn of the situation of the ground, that most of it has originally been washed down by repeated torrents from the neighboring hills. This manner in which it is collected is nearly as follows. About the beginning of December, when the harvest is over and the streams and torrents have greatly subsided, the mansa or chief of the town appoints a day to begin Sanu Ku, gold washing, and the women are sure to have themselves in readiness by the time appointed. A hoe or spade for digging up the sand, 2 or 3 calabashes for washing in it, and a few quills for containing the gold dust, are all the implements necessary for the purpose. On the morning of their departure a bullock is killed for the first day's entertainment, and a number of prayers and charms are used to ensure success, for a failure on that day is thought a bad omen. The Mansa of Camilla, with 14 of his people, were, I remember, so much disappointed in their first day's washing that very few of them had resolution to persevere, and the few that did had but very indifferent success, which indeed is not much to be wondered at, for instead of opening some untried place, they continued to dig and wash in the same spot where they had dug and washed for years, and where, of course, but very few large grains could be left. The washing of the sands of the streams is by far the easiest way of obtaining the gold dust, but in most places the sands have been so narrowly searched before that unless the stream takes some new course, the gold is found but in small quantities. While some of the party are busied in washing the sands, others employ themselves farther up the torrent, where the rapidity of the stream has carried away all the clay, sand, etc., and left nothing but small pebbles. The search among these is a very troublesome task. I have seen women who have had the skin worn off the tops of their fingers in this employment. Sometimes, however, they are rewarded by finding pieces of gold, which they call senu biro, gold stones, that amply repay them for their trouble. A woman and her daughter, inhabitants of Camilla, found in one day two pieces of this kind, one of 5 drachms and the other of 3 drachms weight. But the most certain and profitable mode of washing is practised in the height of the dry season, by digging a deep pit, like a draw well, near some hill which has previously been discovered to contain gold. The pit is dug with small spades or corn hoes, and the earth is drawn up in large calabashes. As the negroes dig through the different strata of clay or sand, a calabash or two of each is washed by way of experiment, and in this manner the laborers proceed until they come to a stratum containing gold, or until they are obstructed by rocks or inundated by water. In general, when they come to a stratum of fine reddish sand, with small black specks therein, they find gold in some proportion or another, and send up large calabashes full of the sand for the women to wash; for though the pit is dug by the men, the gold is always washed by the women, who are accustomed from their infancy to a similar operation in separating the husks of corn from the meal. As I never descended into one of these pits, I cannot say in what manner they are worked underground. Indeed, the situation in which I was placed made it necessary for me to be cautious not to incur the suspicion of the natives by examining too far into the riches of their country; but the manner of separating the gold from the sand is very simple, and is frequently performed by the women in the middle of the town; for when the searchers return from the valleys in the evening, they commonly bring with them each a calabash or two of sand, to be washed by such of the females as remain at home. The operation is simply as follows: a portion of sand or clay, for the gold is sometimes found in a brown colored clay, is put into a large calabash and mixed with a sufficient quantity of water. The woman whose office it is, then shakes the calabash in such a manner as to mix the sand and water together, and give the whole a rotatory motion, at first gently, but afterwards more quickly, until a small portion of sand and water, at every revolution, flies over the brim of the calabash. The sand thus separated is only the coarsest particles mixed with a little muddy water. After the operation has been continued for some time, the sand is allowed to subside, and the water poured off. A portion of coarse sand, which is now uppermost in the calabash, is removed by the hand, and fresh water being added, the operation is repeated until the water comes off almost pure. The women now take a second calabash, and shakes the sand and water gently from the one to the other, reserving that portion of sand which is next the bottom of the calabash and which is most likely to contain the gold. This small quantity is mixed with some pure water, and being moved about in the calabash is carefully examined. If a few particles of gold are picked out, the contents of the other calabash are examined in the same manner, but in general the party is well contented if she can obtain 3 or 4 grains from the contents of both calabashes. Some women, however, by long practice, become so well acquainted with the nature of the sand and the mode of washing it that they will collect gold where others cannot find a single particle. The gold dust is kept in quills stopped up with cotton, and the washers are fond of displaying a number of these quills in their hair. Generally speaking, if a person uses common diligence in a proper soil, it is supposed that as much gold may be collected by him in the course of the dry season as is equal to the value of 2 slaves. Thus simple is the process by which the negroes obtain gold in Manding, and it is evident from this account that the country contains a considerable portion of this precious metal, for many of the smaller particles must necessarily escape the observation of the naked eye, and as the natives generally search the sands of streams at a considerable distance from the hills, and consequently far removed from the mines where the gold was originally produced, the laborers are sometimes but ill paid for their trouble. Minute particles only of this heavy metal can be carried by the current to any considerable distance. The larger must remain deposited near the original source from whence they came. Were the gold bearing streams to be traced to their fountains, and the hills from whence they spring properly examined, the sand in which the gold is there deposited would no doubt be found to contain particles of a much larger size, and even the small grains might be collected to considerable advantage by the use of quicksilver and other improvements, with which the natives are at present unacquainted. Part of this gold is converted into ornaments for the women, but in general these ornaments are more to be admired for their weight than their workmanship. They are massy and inconvenient, particularly the earrings, which are commonly so heavy as to pull down and lacerate the lobe of the ear, to avoid which they are supported by a thong of red leather, which passes over the crown of the head from one ear to the other. The necklace displays greater fancy, and the proper arrangement of the different beads and plates of gold is the great criterion of taste and elegance. When a lady of consequence is in full dress, her gold ornaments may be worth altogether from 50 to 80 pounds sterling. A small quantity of gold is likewise employed by the Slattees in defraying the expenses of their journeys to and from the coast, but by far the greater proportion is annually carried away by the Moors in exchange for salt and other merchandise. During my stay at Camilla, the gold collected by the different traders at that place for salt alone was nearly equal to 198 pounds sterling, and as Camilla is but a small town, and not much resorted to by the trading Moors, this quantity must have borne a very small proportion to the gold collected at Kanakaba, Kankari, and some other large towns. The value of salt in this part of Africa is very great. One slab, about 2 feet and a half in length, 14 inches in breadth, and 2 inches in thickness, will sometimes sell for about £2 10s. sterling, and from £1 15s. to £2 may be considered as the common price. 4 of these slabs are considered as a load for an ass, and 6 for a bullock. The value of European merchandise in Mending varies very much according to the supply from the coast, or the dread of war in the country, but the return for such articles is commonly made in slaves. The price of a prime slave, when I was at Camilla, was from 12 to 9 miniales, and European commodities had then nearly the following value: 18 gun flints, 1 minicale; 48 leaves of tobacco, 1 minicale; 20 charges of gunpowder, 1 minicale; a cutlass, 1 minicale; a musket, from 3 to 4 minicales. The produce of the country and the different necessaries of life when exchanged for gold sold as follows: common provisions for one day, the weight of 1 tilikici; a black bean, 6 of which make the weight of 1 minicale; a chicken, 1 tilikici; a sheep, 3 tilikici; a bullock, 1 minicale; a horse, from 10 to 17 minicales. The negroes weigh the gold in small balances, which they always carry about them. They make no difference, in point of value, between gold dust and wrought gold. In bartering one article for another, the person who receives the gold always weighs it with his own tilikici. These beans are sometimes fraudulently soaked in shea butter to make them heavy, and I once saw a pebble ground exactly in the form of one of them, but such practices are not very common. Having now related the substance of what occurs to my recollection concerning the African mode of obtaining gold from the earth, and its value in barter, I proceed to the next article of which I propose to treat, namely, ivory. Nothing creates a greater surprise among the negroes on the sea coast than the eagerness displayed by the European traders to procure elephants' teeth, it being exceedingly difficult to make them comprehend to what use it is applied. Although they are shown knives with ivory handles, combs and toys of the same material, and are convinced that the ivory thus manufactured was originally parts of a tooth, they are not satisfied. They suspect that this commodity is more frequently converted in Europe to purposes of far greater importance, the true nature of which is studiously concealed from them, lest the price of ivory should be enhanced. They cannot, they say, easily persuade themselves that ships would be built and voyages undertaken to procure an article which had no other value than that of furnishing handles to knives, etc., when pieces of wood would answer that purpose equally well. Elephants are very numerous in the interior of Africa, but they appear to be distinct species from those found in Asia. Blumenbach, in his Figures of Objects of Natural History, has given good drawings of a grinder of each, and the variation is evident. M. Cuvier also has given in the Magazine Encyclopédique a clear account of the difference between them. As I never examined the Asiatic elephant, I have chosen rather to refer to those writers than advance this as an opinion of my own. It has been said that the African elephant is of less docile nature than the Asiatic, and incapable of being tamed. The negroes certainly do not at present tame them, but when we consider that the Carthaginians had always tame elephants in their armies, and actually transported some of them to Italy in the course of the Punic Wars, it seems more likely that they should have possessed the art of taming their own elephants than have submitted to the expense of bringing such vast animals from Asia. Perhaps the barbarous practice of hunting the African elephants for the sake of their teeth has rendered them more untractable and savage than they were found to be in former times. The great part of the ivory which is sold on the Gambia and Senegal rivers is brought from the interior country. The lands towards the coast are too swampy and too much intersected with creeks and rivers for so bulky an animal as the elephant to travel through without being discovered, and when once the natives discern the marks of his feet in the earth, the whole village is up in arms. The thoughts of feasting on his flesh, making sandals of his hide, and selling the teeth to the Europeans inspire every one with courage, and the animal seldom escapes from his pursuers. But in the plains of Bambara and Karta, and the extensive wilds of Jalan Kadu, the elephants are very numerous, and from the great scarcity of gunpowder in those districts, they are less annoyed by the natives. Scattered teeth are frequently picked up in the woods, and travelers are very diligent in looking for them. It is a common practice with the elephant to thrust his teeth under the roots of such shrubs and bushes as grow in the more dry and elevated parts of the country, where the soil is shallow. These bushes he easily overturns and feeds on the roots, which are in general more tender and juicy than the hard, woody branches or the foliage. But when the teeth are partly decayed by age, and the roots more firmly fixed, the great exertions of the animal in this practice frequently cause them to break short. At Camilla I saw two teeth, one a very large one, which were found in the woods, and which were evidently broken off in this manner. Indeed, it is difficult otherwise to account for such a large proportion of broken ivory as is daily offered for sale at the different factories; for when the elephant is killed in hunting, unless he dashes himself over a precipice, the teeth are always extracted entire. There are certain seasons of the year when the elephants collect into large herds, and traverse the country in quest of food or water, and as all that part of the country to the north of the Niger is destitute of rivers, whenever the pools in the woods are dried up, the elephants approach towards the banks of that river. Here they continue until the commencement of the rainy season, in the months of June or July, and during this time they are much hunted by such of the barbarians as have gunpowder to spare. The elephant hunters seldom go out singly; a party of 4 or 5 join together, and having each furnished himself with powder and ball, and a quantity of corn meal in a leather bag sufficient for 5 or 6 days' provision, they enter the most unfrequented parts of the wood, and examine with great care everything that can lead to the discovery of the elephants. In this pursuit, notwithstanding the bulk of the animal, great nicety of observation is required. The broken branches, the scattered dung of the animal, and the marks of his feet are carefully inspected, and many of the hunters have, by long experience and attentive observation, become so expert in their search that as soon as they observe the foot marks of an elephant, they will tell almost to a certainty at what time it passed and what distance it will be found. When they discover a herd of elephants, they follow them at a distance, until they perceive some one stray from the rest, and come into such a situation as to be fired at with advantage. The hunters then approach with great caution, creeping amongst the long grass, until they have got near enough to be sure of their aim. They then discharge all their pieces at once, and throw themselves on their faces among the grass. The wounded elephant immediately applies his trunk to the different wounds, but being unable to extract the balls, and seeing nobody near him, he becomes quite furious and runs about amongst the bushes until by fatigue and loss of blood he has exhausted himself, and affords the hunters an opportunity of firing a second time at him, by which he is generally brought to the ground. The skin is now taken off, and extended on the ground with pegs to dry, and such parts of the flesh as are most esteemed are cut up into thin slices, and dried in the sun, to serve for provisions on some future occasion. The teeth are struck out with a light hatchet which the hunters always carry along with them, not only for that purpose, but also to enable them to cut down such trees as contain honey; for though they carry with them only 5 or 6 days' provisions, they will remain in the woods for months if they are successful, and support themselves upon the flesh of such elephants as they kill and wild honey. The ivory thus collected is seldom brought down to the coast by the hunters themselves. They dispose of it to the itinerant merchants who come annually from the coast with arms and ammunition to purchase this valuable commodity. Some of these merchants will collect ivory in the course of one season, sufficient to load 4 or 5 asses. A great quantity of ivory is likewise brought from the interior by the slave coffles. There are, however, some Slatees of the Mohammedan persuasion who, from motives of religion, will not deal in ivory, nor eat of the flesh of the elephant, unless it has been killed with a spear. The quantity of ivory collected in this part of Africa is not so great, nor are the teeth in general so large, as in the countries nearer the line. Few of them weigh more than 80 or 100 pounds, and upon an average bar of European merchandise may be reckoned as the price of a pound of ivory. I have now, I trust, in this and the preceding chapters, explained with sufficient minuteness the nature and extent of the commercial connection which at present prevails and has long subsisted between the negro natives of those parts of Africa which I visited and the nations of Europe; and it appears that slaves, gold and ivory, together with the few articles enumerated in the beginning of my work, viz., beeswax and honey, hides, gums, and dyed woods, constitute the whole catalogue of exportable commodities. Other productions, however, have been incidentally noticed as the growth of Africa, such as grain of different kinds, tobacco, indigo, cotton wool, and perhaps a few others; but of all these, which can only be obtained by cultivation and labor, the natives raise sufficient only for their own immediate expenditure, nor, under the present system of their laws, manners, trade, and government, can anything further be expected from them. It cannot, however, admit of doubt that all rich and valuable productions both of the East and West Indies might easily be naturalized, and brought to the utmost perfection in the tropical parts of this immense continent. Nothing is wanting to this end but example to enlighten the minds of the natives, and instruction to enable them to direct their industry to proper objects. It was not possible for me to behold the wonderful fertility of the soil, the vast herds of cattle, proper both for labor and food, and a variety of other circumstances favorable to colonization and agriculture, and reflect, withal, on the means which presented themselves of a vast inland navigation without, lamenting that a country so abundantly gifted and favored by nature should remain in its present savage and neglected state. Much more did I lament that a people of manners and disposition so gentle and benevolent should either be left as they now are, immersed in the gross and uncomfortable blindness of pagan superstition, or permitted to become converts to a system of bigotry and fanaticism, which, without enlightening the mind, often debases the heart. On this subject many observations might be made, but the reader will probably think that I have already digressed too largely, and I now, therefore, return to my situation at Camilla. End of Volume 2, Chapter 23. Volume 2, Chapter 24 of Travels in the Interior of Africa by Mungo Park. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mohammedan Customs. Arrival at Kinyataraku. The schoolmaster to whose care I was entrusted during the absence of Carfa was a man of mild disposition and gentle manners. His name was Fankuma, and although he himself adhered strictly to the religion of Mohammed, he was by no means intolerant in his principles toward others who differed from him. He spent much of his time in reading, and teaching appeared to be his pleasure as well as employment. His school consisted of 17 boys, most of whom were sons of Kafirs, and 2 girls, one of whom was Carfa's own daughter. The girls received their instruction in the daytime, but the boys always had their lessons by the light of a large fire, before daybreak and again late in the evening, for being considered, during their scholarship, as the domestic slaves of the master, they were employed in planting corn, bringing firewood, and in other servile offices through the day. Exclusive of the Koran, and a book or two of commentaries thereon, the schoolmaster possessed a variety of manuscripts, which had partly been purchased from the trading Moors, and partly borrowed from bush reens in the neighborhood and copied with great care. Other manuscripts had been produced to me at different places in the course of my journey, and on recounting those I had before seen, and those which were now shown to me, and interrogating the schoolmaster on the subject, I discovered that the negroes are in possession, among others, of an Arabic version of the Pentateuch of Moses, which they call Taurata la Musa. This is so highly esteemed that it is often sold for the value of one prime slave. They have likewise a version of the Psalms of David, Zabura Dawaldi, and lastly the book of Isaiah, which they call Lingili la Isa, and it is in very high esteem. I suspect, indeed, that in all these copies there are interpolations of some of the particular tenets of Mohammed, for I could distinguish in many passages the name of the prophet. It is possible, however, that this circumstance might otherwise have been accounted for if my knowledge of the Arabic had been more extensive. By means of these books, many of the converted negroes have acquired an acquaintance with some of the remarkable events recorded in the Old Testament. The account of our first parents, the death of Abel, the deluge, the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the story of Joseph and his brethren, the history of Moses, David, Solomon, etc. All these have been related to me in the Mandingo language, with tolerable exactness by different people, and my surprise was not greater on hearing these accounts from the lips of the negroes than theirs on finding that I was already acquainted with them; for although the negroes in general have a very great idea of the wealth and power of the Europeans, I am afraid that the Mohammedan converts among them think but very lightly of our superior attainments in religious knowledge. The white traders in the maritime districts take no pains to counteract this unhappy prejudice, always performing their own devotions in secret, and seldom condescending to converse with the negroes in a friendly and instructive manner. To me, therefore, it was not so much the subject of wonder as matter of regret to observe that, while the superstition of Mohammed has in this manner scattered a few faint beams of learning among these poor people, the precious light of Christianity is altogether excluded. I could not but lament that, although the coast of Africa has now been known and frequented by the Europeans for more than 200 years, yet the negroes still remain entire strangers to the doctrines of our holy religion. We are anxious to draw from obscurity the opinions and records of antiquity, the beauties of Arabian and Asiatic literature, etc. But while our libraries are thus stored with the learning of various countries, we distribute with a parsimonious hand the blessings of religious truth to the benighted nations of the earth. The natives of Asia derive but little advantage in this respect from a intercourse with us, and even the poor Africans, whom we affect to consider as barbarians, look upon us, I fear, as little better than a race of formidable but ignorant heathens. When I produced Richardson's Arabic grammar to some Slatees on the Gambia, they were astounded to think that any European should understand and write the sacred language of their religion. At first they suspected it might have been written by some of the slaves carried from the coast, but on a closer examination they were satisfied that no bushireen could write such beautiful Arabic, and one of them offered to give me an ass and 16 bars of goods if I would part with the book. Perhaps a short and easy introduction to Christianity, such as is found in some of the catechisms for children, elegantly printed in Arabic, and distributed on different parts of the coast, might have a wonderful effect. The expense would be but trifling, curiosity would induce many to read it, and the evident superiority which it would possess over their present manuscripts, both in point of elegance and cheapness, might at last obtain it a place among the school books of Africa. The reflections which I have thus ventured to submit to my readers on this important subject naturally suggested themselves to my mind On perceiving the encouragement which was thus given to learning, such as it is, in many parts of Africa, I observed that the pupils at Camellia were most of them children of pagans. Their parents, therefore, could have had no predilection for the doctrines of Mohammed. Their aim was their children's improvement, and if a more enlightened system had presented itself, it would probably have been preferred. The children, too, wanted not a spirit of emulation, which it is the aim of the tutor to encourage. When any one of them has read through the Koran, and performed a certain number of public prayers, a feast is prepared by the schoolmaster, and the scholar undergoes an examination, or, in European terms, takes out his degree. I attended at 3 different inaugurations of this sort, and heard with pleasure the distinct and intelligent answers which the scholars frequently gave to the bushreens, who assembled on those occasions and acted as examiners. When the bushreens had satisfied themselves respecting the learning and abilities of the scholar, the last page of the Koran was put into his hand, and he was desired to read it aloud. After the boy had finished this lesson, he pressed the paper against his forehead and pronounced the word Amen, upon which all the bushreens rose, and shaking him cordially by the hand, bestowed upon him the title of bushreen. When a scholar has undergone this examination, his parents are informed that he has completed his education, and that it is incumbent on them to redeem their son by giving to the schoolmaster a slave or the price of a slave in exchange, which is always done if the parents can afford to do it. If not, the boy remains the domestic slave of the schoolmaster until he can, by his own industry, collect goods sufficient to ransom himself. About a week after the departure of Kafka, 3 Moors arrived at Camellia with a considerable quantity of salt and other merchandise, which they had obtained on credit from a merchant of Fezzan, who had lately arrived at Kankaba. Their engagement was to pay him his price when the goods were sold, which they expected would be in the course of a month. Being rigid bushreens, they were accommodated with 2 of Kafka's huts, and sold the goods to a very great advantage. On the 24th of January Kafka returned to Camellia with a number of people and 13 prime slaves whom he had purchased. He likewise brought with him a young girl whom he had married at Kankaba as his 4th wife, and had given her parents 3 prime slaves for her. She was kindly received at the door of the balloon by Kafka's other wives, who conducted their new acquaintance and co-partner into one of the best huts, which they had caused to be swept and whitewashed on purpose to receive her. My clothes were by this time become so very ragged that I was almost ashamed to appear out of doors, but Kafka, on the day after his arrival, generously presented me with such a garment and trousers as are commonly worn in the country. The slaves which Kafka had brought with him were all of them prisoners of war. They had been taken by the Bambara army in the kingdoms of Wasala and Karta, and carried to Sego, where some of them had remained 3 years in irons. From Sego they were sent, in company with a number of other captives, up the Niger in 2 large canoes, and offered for sale at Yamena, Bamako, and Kankaba, at which places the greater number of the captives were bartered for gold dust, and the remainder sent forward to Kankari. 11 of them confessed to me that they had been slaves from their infancy, but the other 2 refused to give any account of their former condition. They were all very inquisitive, but they viewed me at first with looks of horror, and repeatedly asked if my countrymen were cannibals. They were very desirous to know what became of the slaves after they crossed the salt water. I told them that they were employed in cultivation of the land, but they would not believe me, and one of them, putting his hand upon the ground, said, with great simplicity, "Have you really got such ground as this to set your feet upon?" A deeply rooted idea that the whites purchase negroes for the purpose of devouring them, or of selling them to others that they may be devoured hereafter, naturally makes the slaves contemplate a journey towards the coast with great terror, insomuch that the Slatees are forced to keep them constantly in irons, and watch them very closely to prevent their escape. They are commonly secured by putting the right leg of one and the left of another into the same pair of fetters. By supporting the fetters with a string they can walk, though very slowly. Every 4 slaves are likewise fastened together by the necks with a strong rope of twisted thongs, and in the night an additional pair of fetters is put on their hands, and sometimes a light iron chain passed round their necks. Such of them as evince marks of discontent are secured in a different manner. A thick billet of wood is cut about 3 feet long, and a smooth notch being made upon one side of it, the ankle of the slave is bolted to the smooth part by means of a strong iron staple, one prong of which passes on each side of the ankle. All these fetters and bolts are made from native iron. In the present case they were put on by the blacksmith as soon as the slaves arrived from Kankaba, and were not taken off until the morning on which the coffle departed for Gambia. In other respects the treatment of the slaves during their stay at Kamila was far from being harsh or cruel. They were led out in their fetters every morning to the shade of the tamarind tree, where they were encouraged to play at games of hazard and sing diverting songs, to keep up their spirits, for, though some of them sustained the hardships of their situation with amazing fortitude, the greater part were very much dejected, and would sit all day in a sort of sullen melancholy, with their eyes fixed upon the ground. In the evening their irons were guarded during the night by Kaffa's domestic slaves. But notwithstanding all this, about a week after their arrival, one of the slaves had the address to procure a small knife, with which he opened the rings of his fetters, cut the rope, and made his escape. More of them would probably have got off had they assisted each other, but the slave no sooner found himself at liberty than he refused to stop and assist in breaking the chain which was fastened round the necks of his companions. As all the Slatees and slaves belonging to the coffle were now assembled either at Kamila or at some of the neighboring villages, it might have been expected that we should set out immediately for Gambia. But though the day of our departure was frequently fixed, it was always found expedient to change it. Some of the people had not prepared their dry provisions, others had gone to visit their relations, or collect some trifling debts, and, last of all, it was necessary to consult whether the day would be a lucky one. On account of one of these or other such cases, our departure was put off, day after day, until the month of February was far advanced, after which all the Slattees agreed to remain in their present quarters until the fast moon was over. And here I may remark that loss of time is an object of no great importance in the eyes of a negro. If he has anything of consequence to perform, it is a matter of indifference to him whether he does it to day or to morrow, or a month or two hence, so long as he can spend the present moment with any degree of comfort. He gives himself very little concern about the future. The fast of Ramadan was observed with great strictness by all the bushreens, but instead of compelling me to follow their example, as the Moors did on a similar occasion, Carfa frankly told me that I was at liberty to pursue my own inclination. In order, however, to manifest a respect for their religious opinions, I voluntarily fasted 3 days, which was thought sufficient to screen me from the reproachful epithet of Kafir. During the fast all the Slattees belonging to the coffle assembled every morning in Carfa's house, where the schoolmaster read to them some religious lessons from a large folio volume, the author of which was an Arab of the name of Shifa. In the evening such of the women had embraced Mohammedanism assembled and said their prayers publicly at the Mesira. They were all dressed in white, and went through the different prostrations prescribed by their religion with becoming solemnity. Indeed, during the whole fast of Ramadan the negroes behaved themselves with the greatest meekness and humility, forming a striking contrast to the savage intolerance and brutal bigotry which at this period characterized the Moors. When the fast month was almost at an end, the bushreens assembled at the Mesira to watch for the appearance of the new moon, but the evening being rather cloudy, they were for some time disappointed, and a number of them had gone home with a resolution to fast another day, when on a sudden this delightful object showed her sharp horns from behind a cloud, and was welcomed with the clapping of hands, beating of drums, firing of muskets, and other marks of rejoicing. As this moon is reckoned extremely lucky, Carfa gave orders that all the people belonging to the coffle should immediately pack up their dry provisions and hold themselves in readiness, and on the 16th of April the Slattees held a consultation and fixed on the 19th of the same month as the day on which the coffle should depart from Camilla. This resolution freed me from much uneasiness, for our departure had already been so long deferred that I was apprehensive it might still be put off until the commencement of the rainy season; and although Carfa behaved towards me with the greatest kindness, I found my situation very unpleasant. The Slattees were unfriendly to me, and the trading Moors who were at this time at Camilla continued to plot mischief against me from the first day of their arrival. Under these circumstances I reflected that my life in a great measure depended on the good opinion of an individual who was daily hearing malicious stories concerning the Europeans, and I could hardly expect that he would always judge with impartiality between me and his countrymen. Time had, indeed, reconciled me in some degree to their mode of life, and a smoky hut or a scanty supper gave me no great uneasiness; but I became at last wearied out with a constant state of alarm and anxiety, and felt a painful longing for the manifold blessings of civilized society. April 19th. The long wished for day of our departure was at length arrived, and the Slattees, having taken the irons from their slaves, assembled with them at the door of Carfa's house, where the bundles were all tied up, and every one had his load assigned him. The coffle, on its departure from Camilla, consisted of 27 slaves for sale, the property of Carfa and 4 other Slattees, but we were afterwards joined by 5 at Maraboo and 3 at Bala, making in all 35 slaves. The freemen were 14 in number, but most of them had 1 or 2 wives and some domestic slaves, and the schoolmaster, who was now upon his return for word adieu, the place of his nativity, took with him 8 of his scholars, so that the number of free people and domestic slaves amounted to 38, and the whole amount of the coffle was 73. Among the freemen were 6 Gilikias (singing men), whose musical talents were frequently exerted either to divert our fatigue or obtain us a welcome from strangers. When we departed from Camilla, we were followed for about half a mile by most of the inhabitants of the town, some of them crying and others shaking hands with their relations who were now about to leave them, and when we had gained a piece of rising ground, from which we had a view of Camilla, all the people belonging to the coffle were ordered to sit down in one place with their faces towards the west, and the townspeople were desired to sit down in another place with their faces towards Camilla. In this situation the schoolmaster, with 2 of the principal Slattees, having taken their places between the 2 parties, pronounced a long and solemn prayer, after which they walked 3 times round the coffle, making an impression in the ground with the ends of their spears, and muttering something by the way of charm. When this ceremony was ended, all the people belonging to the coffle sprang up, and, without taking a formal farewell of their friends, set forwards. As many of the slaves had remained for years in irons, the sudden exertion of walking quickly with heavy loads upon their heads occasioned spasmodic contractions of their legs, and we had not proceeded above a mile before it was found necessary to take 2 of them from the rope, and allow them to walk more slowly until we reached Maraboo, a walled village, where some people were waiting to join the coffle. Here we stopped about 2 hours, to allow the strangers time to pack up their provisions, and then continued our route to Bala, which town we reached about 4 in the afternoon. The inhabitants of Bala at this season of the year subsist chiefly on fish, which they take in great plenty from the streams in the neighborhood. We remained here until the afternoon of the next day, the 20th, when we proceeded to Warrumbang, the frontier village of Manding, towards Jalon Kadu. As we proposed shortly to enter the Jalanka wilderness, the people of this village furnished us with great plenty of provisions, and on the morning of the 21st we entered the woods to the westward of Wurumbang. After having traveled some little way, a consultation was held whether we should continue our route through the wilderness or save one day's provisions by going to Kinitakoru, a town in Jalon Kadu. After debating the matter for some time, it was agreed that we should take the road for Kinitakoru, but as that town was a long day's journey distant, it was necessary to take some refreshment. Accordingly, every person opened his provision bag and brought a handful or two of meal to the place where Karfa and the Slatis were sitting. When every one had brought his quota, and the whole was properly arranged in small gourd shells, the schoolmaster offered up a short prayer, the substance of which was that God and the holy prophet might preserve us from robbers and all bad people, that our provisions might never fail us, nor our limbs become fatigued. This ceremony being ended, every one partook of the meal and drank a little water, after which we set forward, rather running than walking, until we came to the river Kokoru, a branch of the Senegal, where we halted about 10 minutes. The banks of this river are very high, and from the grass and brushwood which had been left by the stream, it was evident that at this place the water had risen more than 20 feet perpendicular during the rainy season. At this time it was only a small stream, such as would turn a mill, swarming with fish, and on account of the number of crocodiles and the danger of being carried past the ford by the force of the stream in the rainy season, it is called Kokoru, dangerous. From this place we continued to travel with the greatest expedition, and in the afternoon crossed two small branches of the Kokoru. About sunset we came in sight of Kinitakoru, a considerable town, nearly square, situated in the middle of a large and well cultivated plain. Before we entered the town, we halted until the people who had fallen behind came up. During this day's travel, two slaves, a woman and a girl, belonging to a Slati of Bala, were so much fatigued that they could not keep up with the coffle. They were severely whipped and dragged along until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when they were both afflicted with vomiting, by which it was discovered that they had eaten clay. This practice is by no means uncommon amongst the negroes, but whether it arises from a vitiated appetite or from a settled intention to destroy themselves, I cannot affirm. They were permitted to lie down in the woods, and 3 people remained with them until they had rested themselves. But they did not arrive at the town until past midnight, and were then so much exhausted that the Slati gave up all thoughts of taking them across the woods in their present condition, and determined to return with them to Bala and wait for another opportunity. As this was the first town beyond the limits of Manding, greater etiquette than usual was observed. Every person was ordered to keep his proper station, and we marched towards the town in a sort of procession, nearly as follows: in front 5 or 6 singing men, all of them belonging to the coffle. These were followed by the other free people. Then came the slaves, fastened in the usual way by a rope round their necks, 4 of them to a rope, and a man with a spear between each 4. After them came the domestic slaves, and in the rear the women of free condition, wives of the Slattees, etc. In this manner we proceeded until we came within 100 yards of the gate, when the singing men began a loud song, well calculated to flatter the vanity of the inhabitants, by extolling their known hospitality to strangers and their particular friendship for the Mandingoes. When we entered the town we proceeded to the bentang, where the people gathered round us to hear our Dentenghi history. This was related publicly by 2 of the singing men. They enumerated every little circumstance which happened to the coffle, beginning with the events of the present day, and relating everything in a backward series until they reached Camilla. When this history was ended, the master of the town gave them a small present, and all the people of the coffle, both free and enslaved, were invited by some person or another and accommodated with lodging and provisions for the night. End of Volume 2, Chapter 24.